everybody. Welcome to Shapeshifts the Video. Today is a new episode, and Stu Barr called me during the week and actually had a good idea. This is very rare, by the way.
I always have good ideas. You just don't listen. You never listen. You don't
sometimes
listen.
You go to sleep and you get this idea.
When you're
that
talking,
you think you're
everybody goes to sleep.
Well, you do, but I get a phone call like at 9 o'clock at night, which is highly unusual, and I have to listen to Stu Barr talk about this great idea that he has. And the idea was that each of us have an extensive library, and a grand idea was to start a new series called Recommended Books from the Shapeshifts Library. And today we're going to do 2 books apiece, and hopefully it'll be a enlightening period. I think Stu's going to do a lot of history. I'm going to do some science. We have a guest director
That's right.
today.
We need everybody to know.
Yes, we do.
We have our guest director.
Well, let's say anything about Sparky.
Sparky got hired by somebody else,
somewhere,
and he
for a
dumps
little
us for now. He said he'd come back, but we don't know.
Nothing but a stepping stone. We get nothing.
Yeah,
the
and he
video
dumps
people
us.
get all the accolades,
Yeah,
so
it's
they
terrible.
get taken away.
But
he's working. Evangelaris in Hollywood. I don't know where Sparky is. Probably somewhere like that.
But we have Heatherly Wildlife Leary today as our director. Say hi to everybody, Heatherly Wildlife.
Yes.
That's it. There we go.
And no student guest today.
No.
So we don't have that going on.
One other thing.
What's that?
Heatherly, she's going to be a guest on a future episode.
So you will see Heatherly Wildlife Leary in one of the next upcoming episodes.
Yeah, upcoming episodes.
So I hope you enjoy some of the books that we selected. Now I think I'll let Stu start with the books that you've selected, Stu.
What I've done is I've selected some books about history, and they're not normally recorded history. Most people think we talk about World War II and you say, well, 1945 ended, everybody's happy, blah, blah, blah. That's not what happens. Not what happens at all. And I have 2 books, fairly recent, out in the last couple of years. The first one is called Aftermath, Life in the Fallout of the Third Reich, 1945 to 1955.
Harold Johnner, it was a bestseller in Germany, been translated now into English.
What year is that again, Stu?
This, I think, came out in German, I think 2019.
Oh, so it's relatively recent then. Yeah,
and this one, The Bitter Taste of Victory, Life, Love, and Art in the Ruins of the Reich.
I want to describe that cover, too.
Yeah, I love this cover. This is Marlene Dietrich sitting in the ruins of Berlin.
So what I want to do is look at these books here, and what they do, they bring up that the war didn't end for many, many people in 1945. One of the largest migrations in history occurred between 45 and 47. And as a little historical background, when the Allies conquered Germany at the end of the war, the Allies decided to turn Germany strictly into an agricultural nation. There would be no industry, no nothing, therefore no war. That would change as the Cold War ratcheted up 47 and 48. And then what would become West Germany would suddenly be industrialized, and the Berlin Airlift changed everything. You saw the sharp division between the former allies of the Soviet Union, Britain, United States, and France. Mm-hmm. So what these books are about, though, is not that. That's the background of it. These are individual lives. And I'll look at this one first, Aftermath, Life in the Fallout of the Third Reich. This cover on here shows some people walking through the streets of Berlin in July of 45. Nothing left. Okay, they bombed it. The Nazis were horrible people. And they got bombed. But what that overlooks a lot of times is something that's, what about the average person? What about the person who's just living their lives? What about the 8 or 9-year-old child who had nothing to do with any of this? Millions upon millions of Germans, Russians, and others were displaced at the end of the war. When the war ended, millions of Russians had no place to go. Russian POWs, often if they returned to Russia, were imprisoned or executed for getting captured. Millions of Germans that had lived in areas that became part of Poland or Czechoslovakia, whose families had lived there for 400 or 500 years, were expelled. Those areas, great expulsions. Aftermath is about just the idea, some of the things that goes on. One of the more important things in here is the role women played. At the end of the war, where are the men in Germany? They're either captured or dead. Millions upon. There's nobody around. The women are left to pick up the mess. The rubble in Berlin, to clean it up, they called them rubble women. They literally employed women on lines, and they would haul rubble away day in, day out. Some of the earliest police forces in Berlin are run by women. It's not an exaggeration to say at the end of the war, who knows what if it would have happened to Germany without the German women.
Yeah. Can you get an idea of what the population disparity was?
Well, we're talking millions. There's no accurate statistics. Yeah. So many had died in the war. Nobody cares about counting the Germans.
Nobody particularly. But these women now have no place to go. Their houses are bombed, but they're cleaning up. There's in this book, you'll see pictures of a woman. She's in a wedding dress, cleaning rubble. Why is she in that dress? That's the only clothes she's got. The others are gone. Yes. Also, you have all kinds of civic problems here. I wanted to read something here, a poem that was written by one of the marchers.
This is by Eric Fried, written in 1945. We marched past death and left it behind us because death too loses its breath in the headlong alleys. We move into our homes on our crutches. Nothing can threaten us now. So today let us be merry, for yesterday we were dead.
The period that we're talking about here is, of course, from 45 to...
About 1950, 51. But what these books do is they talk about individual lives. A lot of times historians miss this. Who are the people? If you lived there, what would you have done? The other book here, I recommend both these books highly to somebody. You don't need to be a historian, but you do need to understand it, how people felt. The Bitter Taste of Victory. Life, Love, and Art in the Ruins of the Reich. This does the same thing. This covers basically till 51, 52. One of the interesting things that comes up is one of the first things open up in Germany, actually by the Russians in their sector, were theaters and concert halls. Movie palaces opened up. These Germans have nothing, but they want to go to a classical concert. They want to see a movie. They don't even care if it's in Russian. They don't care what it is. They want some kind of an escape. They see that. American artists, Marlene Dietrich, the Manns, Ernest Hemingway, all these American artistic figures go to Germany to help try to rebuild it. There's a famous story by Marlene Dietrich. She's in there helping it rebuild it. And then she went through one of the concentration camps. She was so appalled, she walked out and said, I'm done with Germans. I could care less about them. She was in Paris, and she met a friend of hers, and they're talking, and she said, I'm done. And the friend said to her, well, that's nice. What about the 8-year-old who had nothing to do with it? What about the infant that's born of the 2 million German women raped by Russians? What about the children born out of that? What's going to happen to them? What about the people who had nothing to do with it? What about the people in the concentration camps that the Allies liberated and just set them loose in Germany? No place for them to go. They wandered around. They had no food, no shelter, no clothing. Because the Allies, not out of meanness, nobody was equipped to handle this disaster. And so they asked her, and she said, I never thought of it. She went back to Germany.
What was the essential food, essential elements that were gone? Where did they get them?
Well, a lot of food wasn't there. Millions of Germans starved between 45 and 50. Almost as many Germans died between 45 and 50 as died in the war.
Yeah, we forget that war is one thing. The aftermath of war is a
totally and the Allies are the victors. I want to tell a story. It's not in this book. There was a guy I used to know who taught at college with each, He served in the German army, drafted at age 16. He went through the war, but he brought up an interesting point to me once. He said, for us veterans on the losing side, there are no veterans groups. There's no support mechanism. Whatever we have as PTSD does not exist for us. And if we associate with other German veterans, we're automatically Nazis. And so I'm bringing that up because both these books, they're not making excuses for this. I love this in here, in the introduction here to the Aftermath. It says, a revelatory history of the transformational decade that followed World War II, when Germany raised itself out of the ashes of defeat, turned away from fascism, reckoned with the corruption of its soul and the horrors of the Holocaust. This book received wide acclaim and apparent 48 weeks on the bestseller list in Germany where it was published. So it's one of those cases where you see, I think it's important for people to realize history. It's interesting to read the great military events, the great leaders, but history is made up of people, everyday common people who often get ignored. The other side of both of these, though, is a very important thing for American history. The Berlin Airlift changed conceptions forever about what Germany would become. The Berlin Airlift occurred because Stalin decided that East Germany, which was under the Russian zone, Berlin was divided into 4 occupation zones of the 4 powers: Britain, France, United States, and Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union decided to cut Berlin off so it could have the entire city. The United States made it crystal clear they would go ahead and feed Berlin. So for over a year, an airlift fed a city of millions of people, one of the greatest airlifts. From then on, Germany, particularly dealing with the United States and France, Germany would become a staunch ally. What would become West Germany? And Germany, that was to be an agricultural nation at the end of the war, so it could never fight another war, quickly became a major partner in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. My point in bringing this up is history is more than just a set of nice events. This one, Bitter Taste, is very much about culture.
Interesting to contrast that in the 20s, the philosophical context was logical positivism.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's
you-
the next
and we
episode,
did
by
that-
the way.
Yeah, next episode's coming up. But we should contrast that because that particular movement with Wittgenstein and the whole crowd of
Yeah.
logicians and Schlick
Yeah.
and so on really started an entire
Well,
movement.
Wittgenstein, remember, was never a member of the circle.
Well, he was never a member, but
Yeah.
they focused.
Yeah, they loved him.
Well, it was designed.
Carnap was the one that-
Exactly, but they designed around him.
Yes,
and,
yeah.
But he was kind of a god in a way.
Yeah.
But the contrast is that in logical positivism, it did have an influence on art, it had influence on plays, it had influence on theater. It influenced everything in that particular period. After the war, what's the contrast? What do you see?
Well, the contrast is you don't have time for philosophy. A lot of German academics, contrary to popular belief, sided with the Nazis. We always hear in this country, academics are always liberal. Most of history, academics are conservative.
Mm-hmm.
The liberal ones left Germany if they could. Some stayed. A lot of the liberal faculty members ended up dying in concentration camps. They ostracized by 1938 anybody who wasn't. They were kicked out of the universities. A lot of the more liberal ones, when they started kicking the Jews out in 33 and 34, said, we're done.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened in here, too, in the Bitter Taste of Victory, is how the culture changed. And it brings up a point that some of the academicians would use at the end of the war.
Mm-hmm.
Is it better to leave or better to stay and try to corrupt the system from within? I don't have an answer to that moral question, but we do know there were people who did stay and just put roadblocks. The Nazis, for as much as they were one of the most horribly inefficient people in history, their whole system was based on people fighting with each other so Hitler could stay at the top and never be threatened. Well, that's a great place for you to throw wrenches into the machine. But the culture in here, the bringing back culture, bringing back music was very important to bring back to Germany. Theater was extremely important. And movies. This was bringing back culture, though, as this whole book is how do I bring back the culture, not just German culture, but world culture. How do I bring it back? And as much as I talked about the Russians and all, the Russians were the first to bring it back into Germany. The Russians in East Germany quickly realized movies, things settles the population down. They gave away tickets. They gave away. Early on in Berlin, the 4 sectors, unlike we would get usually brought up the Berlin Wall, originally people moved around the 4 sectors easily. Nobody cared. And not only people, Russian soldiers could be found in the American sector, and everybody moved around. So Russians put up theaters. Well, very quickly, people in the other 3 sectors would go to the Russian sector to watch movies, to hear a concert. A lot of this, and it was an attempt. Bitter Taste of Victory is how do I bring culture back to this? And it was one of the reasons Americans recruited people in Hollywood. One of the things forgotten before I finish this, how many directors in Hollywood came from Germany and run from the Nazis in the 30s? Well, the Americans quickly wanted to bring them back to Germany
to try and reintroduce a culture. I just want to, and oh, by the way, it says I left that out. Life, love, marriage, sexual, we might call promiscuity, no one cares. When your life has been blown to pieces, you're not worried about who's sleeping with somebody. You're lucky if you find 2 potatoes to boil that day for food.
Those are the essentials, right?
You get rid of a lot of the nonsense. What Germany would become in the 50s and 60s, often seen in Europe as a very open society, is rooted in that. Because when you go through that, these issues suddenly, they're not important to you. Why would I? Somebody else can care about them because they have the luxury to care.
That's right.
Anyway, that's my harp on today.
Great. Thanks, Stu.
Yeah.
I should mention one thing. Let me look at this book for a second. This is a very unusual title. The usual books I see at Stu Barr's library are something like this. Germany, October 15th, 1932, 10 a.m. to 10:15 a.m. 695 pages. So this was a shortened version of what we usually get with Stu Barr talking about a book. Hey, great, Stu. And my two books are on slightly different in this context. The first one is a book called Helgoland, pretty much making sense of the quantum revolution is the subtitle. It's written by...
Explain to people where Helgoland is, because it's not too far from what we're talking about.
I was going to. Helgoland is actually German. It's an island in the North Sea. It's desolate, basically desolate. No trees. And it's a very good place to go to if you have allergies, because there's nothing there. And the book is written by Carlo Rovelli, a great physicist who I actually had the pleasure of meeting several years ago at the conferences that I used to attend. And his thesis in the book about Helgoland is that something amazing happened in 1925. Werner Heisenberg. Now, Heisenberg is a word that you might have heard from a particular series on TV. But Heisenberg is a physicist. It was at this point. Werner Heisenberg.
I should run bridge. Werner Heisenberg got a lot of flack after work because he stayed with Germany, stayed with the Nazis.
And may have been responsible for
the failure of the, we don't know.
We're not sure. The failure of the German advances in atomic energy.
Right.
But a very fascinating thing happened in 1925, and that was Werner Heisenberg didn't have allergies. He takes an extended trip to, I think in June of 1925, to Helgoland. Because of his allergies, he could go there, but his real main purpose of going there was to think. And he was thinking because at that point, the revolution in physics was boiling. You had in 1905 special theory of relativity. Einstein was now gaining huge popularity. By 1915, he's come up with the general theory of relativity, of which we're going to get black holes and wormholes, all the fancy things we get about space-time bending and so on. And at the same time, you have the microscopic world being investigated with higher instrumentation and so on. They're able to now see things they weren't able to see before, not in the sense of visually seeing something, but in the sense of seeing the effects of something, mostly the atom. And so you have the quantum world, the world of the microscopic, and the macroscopic world, the world of cosmology. Not in clash at all, but certainly in collaboration in this context. Well, Heisenberg is on the microscopic end. And his cohorts are Dirac, Bohr, Schrodinger, and so on. And he is confused because they've been trying to find out what is the mechanism of an electron. How does an electron move, particularly around an atom? And an electron being a particle, they knew of its existence. The nucleus of an atom was also known, recently known what it was, made of subatomic particles called protons and neutrons, to be discovered a little later. But the point was, how does the electron do what it does on an atom? And there are many, many theories going around. We don't study them anymore because they were fallacious. But the point was, were there new forces that were dictating the motion of an electron versus what goes on between a billiard ball and a billiard table, right? How does it move? Through classical physics of Newton. Well, what bothered Heisenberg was that all these people were looking for these new forces that were dictating electrons, but he goes to the island and he gets this revelation. He says, I'm not going to abandon physics. I'm not going to abandon it. I'm going to say, which I mentioned earlier, maybe the positives have something here, the logical positive have something. Maybe we should look at what's really we observe, and maybe that should be telling us something. So he says, abandon all looking for these forces that may or may not exist. Let's go with what the atom is telling us. What do we get from the atom? Light. It's like looking at the universe. What do we get from the universe? We just get light. That's all we get. We get nothing else. You don't feel a star. You don't go star bathing. You don't sense a star. You know.
Only a physicist would tell you that.
In other words, it's completely outside of your experiential domain. So what do we get is light. So Heisenberg gets this idea that we should look into the atom itself. What is the atom telling us? And this creates a whole new way to think, and it becomes what eventually will turn out to be what we call the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, because if the electron is doing something in an atom, it's doing something in violation of the usual physics. We won't get into the details about that. But it's taking these orbits. An electron rotates around the nucleus in the old model, let's say, not the case at all, but in that mental picture of a solar system model where you have a planet going around the sun, you have an electron going around a nucleus, is not a good model. But that's what we had at the time. So he revolutionizes the thinking of physics, and he comes back from Helgoland and brings forth this particular idea. And he starts looking into certain numbers that were being measured, again, observationally, in spectral analysis of the light coming from an atom, particularly the hydrogen atom. And Niels Bohr, who had really developed the mechanism of how this atom may be functioning, had to throw in a lot of assumptions, 3 in particular that were a violation of classical physics. And if you accept these 3, then these three assumptions, then classical physics kind of falls apart in that context. But it did work beautifully. Well, Heisenberg puts these numbers, these energy level, I'll call them energy level, these numbers into a matrix format. And he kind of says, this is what the atom is telling us. Let's move with that. And Helgoland is the title of the book. It's a fascinating read, because if you really have heard the word quantum mechanics, which you probably have, quantum attached to anything becomes now a big selling point. I just saw the other day, quantum diet. I'm wondering what that is. I'd like to find out what a quantum diet is. And then I found out there's something called quantum nutrition. And
what is that? I saw that.
Well, you put quantum to it, it's a selling feature.
That makes sense.
Go into any movie that you'll see, they'll use the word, quantum mechanical, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's fine. But it's become a buzzword in this context. But most physicists, and we go back to it every time, when asked what quantum mechanics is, the most famous line I can think of, it comes from Richard Feynman in the 60s, and he says, no one understands quantum mechanics. And that's from one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, apart from Einstein. And Ravelli really puts in place several ideas about quantum mechanics that are nice, but they go into the extremities about our reasoning, multiverses, and where we have different universes that we don't interact with. Well, what good is that? If you can interact with another universe, why even bring it up? You basically, you have found heaven and hell, I guess. But the point is, that is one of many, many ideas. What I liked about Ravelli's book is that he's an advocate of a rather really great idea, which I like, called relational quantum mechanics. And that's what Helgoland is about. He says, let's start with Heisenberg, who began a revolution in physics, what we call quantum mechanics. The result of that is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle that says certain things cannot happen simultaneously. Give an example, I cannot measure the position of a particle at the same time that I can measure its velocity. Think of light as being consistent with particles, and it makes sense in one way. A particle of light, a photon coming into an electron, strikes an electron. By the time the photon reflects back, let's say, in a simple explanation, the electron's already been bolted away like a billiard ball, right? So once I get the information of where the particle was, it's gone. And therefore, I might know at one point where it was, but what's its velocity? Well, I don't know. It's gone off with another velocity. So there's an uncertainty about certain things. Energy and time are uncertain about. I can't measure them simultaneously for other reasons. Position and momentum, I can't measure them simultaneously. So this has been really the foundation of quantum mechanics. One thing that Ravelli did in his book, which I really enjoyed, Relational Quantum Mechanics, takes an extreme picture, and he says that, in essence, particles have no defining characteristics. They have neither charge, velocity, position, mass, unless they interact with another particle. Now, that's one way to look at it. Now, you look at it and say, no, wait a minute. When one particle interacts, then it takes on these properties. And the interesting fact is, it's not me that sees these particular properties, it's the particle that you're interacting with that sees these properties. It's a fascinating idea. An electron doesn't become an electron unless it's interacting with either another electron or something else.
So to do anything, let's just observe.
Yeah,
Whatever that means.
the only an analogy I'll give is very bad. I apologize to Carlo Ravelli if I'm misinterpreting if I have. Think of the letter Q. It has no meaning. It's not a word. You can make it into a word. I'm not spelling out the word Q. I just see a letter, a symbol Q. But put Q to the letter U, and now you may have quick. Q-U-I-C-K. The Q has no meaning until it's attached to something else.
That's a good analogy.
Of course, it's a bad analogies in physics.
Well, yeah,
and
but it's
philosophy. The fallacy
a
of
good
analogy.
visual
It's a
one.
good visual one. Letters by themselves have no meaning, but put them in relation to something else, they have meaning. The issue is that I'm seeing it as the word quick. There's the fallacy itself. Q takes on the meaning by the letter U. U understands Q. Q understands U in terms of these properties, which we don't have. So there's the analogy fails, but you get the idea. So I think for a person who's interested in understanding a lot about quantum mechanics, because the book goes into the history and some of the ideas that are necessary to understand it at a very good level, not where you need all these technical mathematical phrases and mathematics understand it. And it's a really good historical account with a more modern approach called relational quantum mechanics.
What's your other one? I'm trying to remember. Was it Lost in Math?
No, the other one is Lost in Math by Sabine Hossenfelder, a theoretical physicist, a particle physicist, and she wrote this in 2018, and I highly recommend this one. The subtitle is, and here's a part of it that we're going to discuss, and that is How Beauty Leads Physics Astray. And it's a fascinating book because it's almost like a confession in a way. And I have to thank her profusely for this because myself being a theoretical physicist fell into the idea that I remember as a graduate student, my advisor when I was doing my thesis, we were working this unusual, well not unusual, but a very complicated differential geometric structure. And he toys with one thing called a vector field, and he does something to it, and then he hands it to me, and he says, go ahead, take this and see where it goes. And there I am struggling for 2 years, writing this thesis and trying to do these calculations, and you sort of get this interesting aspect that the mathematics that I'm doing is beginning to define the universe. And I look at this, and there was a point where I had to show this rather complicated equation would go to zero. I didn't know it would or wouldn't, and if it goes to zero, that meant something. If it didn't go to zero, there goes my thesis. So about 15 pages later, I'm shocked it goes to zero. It took me a week to redo it, to make sure, because knowing me, I made a mistake. Knowing the way I am, I want something to happen, it's going to happen. So it took me a very long time to convince myself that my calculation was okay. I showed it to my advisor, and then you start realizing, does mathematics describe our universe? And if it does it make the universe? And this is really what I think Sabine is talking about. We have been led astray by the idea of beauty. Nature, we use the word, isn't that beautiful in nature? But did nature design beauty? or did our mind design beauty? And this goes right back to Aristotle, and goes
Well,
back
actually,
even earlier than that.
It goes back to basic epistemology.
Epistemology.
Is our descriptions of nature,
Right.
or are they psychological impositions on nature?
On nature, and are there patterns that we say this is beautiful? And it's a very broad term, beauty, and it's a very philosophical term. That's why I always said the philosophy of aesthetics is probably the hardest philosophy I've ever tried to study. Epistemology is one thing, ontology is another thing, but when you get down to beauty, how complicated is that? Because everybody knows beauty.
And when you're dealing with math, what does beauty mean?
What does
in
beauty
math?
mean?
And what does it have to do with nature?
And what we compartmentalize in mathematics is straightforward. When I look at a mathematical structure, I can see a theorem, and it's complicated, and it has a lot of ins and outs and tentacles going on in another, and I see the same theorem proved differently in 3 lines. Here I call this ugly math because it's an ugly proof, and here's the same proof, basically same conclusion, different kind of structure, elegant 3 lines. There's a beauty there. I can say, yes, this is okay.
So simplicity is beauty?
So, well, that's the problem. You look at it, you go, in mathematics it is, and you look at it and you go, wait a minute, did I need any more premises or assumptions on the elegant proof? So I'm going to use the word elegant rather than beauty, beautiful. But a mathematician might say something like, this is beautiful. In the same way that Hardy, J.H. Hardy in 1930, I believe, writes A Mathematician's Apology. He says, well, I studied this all my life, and what have I really done? And he says, well, mathematics is beautiful, and I have couched myself in the beauty of mathematics. That's where he saw himself. Now that's okay, because mathematics is a human mental construct. Now let's impose that on nature. Does nature create this beauty and we see it, or do we create a pattern and call it beautiful? Like harmony in music. Discordance is not pleasing. Harmony is. I look at trees, and my favorite example would be a Christmas tree, right? And my favorite Christmas tree was one that was scraggly and crooked, because I felt sorry for it. Where did that come from? But and I go to my cousins' places or wherever, and their trees were just perfect. Same tree, but one had a beauty to it that mine didn't. But mine was beautiful in my sense, but that was me. But,
so in the math end, though, according to, it goes down to a basic epistemological question. Is the universe a mathematical structure, or is a mathematical structure merely a definition of the universe?
Right.
I don't mean definite, description.
Description. It's a description or a prescription, basically, the distinction. So mathematics itself has become the cornerstone of all physics. And I think what Heisenfelter has done in her book is to bring forth the idea that maybe this is not the right pathway to go. Maybe the idea of beauty is fine in certain disciplines like mathematics. And I have to admit, when I see an elegant proof, I do sense a sense of beauty. That's the way I look at it. But does that beauty carry itself into the universe as in the understanding that this is a natural thing? And she brings that out very carefully by what we call in physics the idea of the standard model. And the standard model has this great structure. It's beautiful. It's the most exact theory we ever had in physics, but it does require the idea of what we call supersymmetry. And supersymmetry is kind of a natural extension that's a necessity. It might even be particles of supersymmetry, might even explain dark matter to some extent. And the problem is, nobody has seen the particles predicted in supersymmetry. In the greatest experiments we've ever done in the past 20 years, we indeed have that problem, that they don't exist, at least not at this point. So her book, again, I'm going to recommend it highly, Lost in Math, How Beauty Leads Physics Astray.
Well, that was good. I think we're going to use this as a normal series, because I've had people ask, where do you get these books? Most of the time I find my books by wandering around a bookstore. I don't really know what I'm looking for.
It used to be you go to several bookstores, but now it's hard to find. And I've heard that one of the fastest growing industries in the United States today is independent bookstores. And you just find them and just roam around, and they're wonderful.
So we will continue to another episode, bring you some nice books to keep your day happy.
So look forward
Some aren't so cheery, but that's
we'll
okay.
find it.
And Tony will come in here for another science lecture. All
We-
right. Thank you,
Thank you
everybody.
very much, and see you next time.
See you next time.